Keyword: environment. The term environment, in its broadest sense, indexes contested terrains located at the intersections of political, social, cultural, ecological, and economic systems. In its narrowest sense, it refers to the place of nature in human history. In each of these usages, representations of the natural world are understood as having a decisive force in shaping environmental policy and the environmental imagination. In Keywords, Raymond William notes, nature is perhaps the most complex word in the language. Nature has meant the countryside, the unspoiled places, plants and creatures other than man. Nature is what man has not made. At the heart of this conception of nature lies the sense that there exists inherent, universal, and primary law beyond the corrupt societies of man. Conservation politics were inspired by this understanding of particular places as untouched by the industrial revolutions of the 19th century. Much 20th century ecological thought inherited this preoccupation with wilderness traditions, pastoralism, and the 18th century romantic impulse of nature writing. In contrast, indigenous and post-colonial scholars point out that imaginative writing about nature has a long tradition among colonial settlers, attempting to mythologize and indigenize their relationships to place. In the 21st century, many of these competing voices have coalesced around an analysis of the Anthropocene, a term coined in 2000 by atmospheric chemist Paul J. Crutzen, to name a geological era in which human activity has become the dominant influence on climate and the environment. At the same time, planet-altering events have come to dominate popular and academic ecological discourses: global climate change, rising sea levels, the loss of land, and sources of potable water. While environment is not one of Williams' key words, ecology does make an appearance, even though the term was not common in the English language until the middle of the 20th century. Ecology, defined as the study of the relations of plants and animals with each other and their habitat, replaced environment, a word in use since the early 19th century, but derived from the mid-14th century, borrowing from the Old French environ, meaning to surround or close. In American studies and cultural studies, environment has undergone a renewal among scholars and activists, owing in part to resistance to the bracketing of nature and wilderness as privileged sites of national identity, and its acceptance as a shorthand for research on ecosystems and diverse environmental movements. Though now used less often in popular culture, the term ecology has been condensed to a three-letter prefix, eco, in the names of social and intellectual movements such as eco-criticism and ecofeminism. In the late 18th century, a transatlantic romantic movement coincided with U.S. independence to produce a form of settler colonialism in which nature, understood as wilderness, came to underwrite a new national identity. A harmonious relationship with the sublime, wild nature became a way of articulating civilized U.S. American purity against the perceived decadence of Europe. With Henry David Thoreau's version of transcendentalism, wildness came to symbolize absolute freedom. Lawrence Buell locates the American environmental imagination in the canonization of Thoreau as a naturalist by late 19th century ecologists such as John Muir. Nevertheless, Muir's ecological ethos dispenses with Thoreau's 18th century romanticism in two ways: by arguing that abuse of nature is wrong, and by asserting that nature has intrinsic value and consequently possesses at least the right to exist. The narrow sense of environment as a discourse on wilderness protection has fueled criticism by ecofeminists, urban ecologists, and environmental and climate justice thinkers. Ecofeminists suggest that human relationships with the natural world would have been engendered by a masculinist impulse to imagine and experience the land as feminine. In response, ecofeminism attempts to deconstruct the nature-culture dualism that situates nature, women, and ethnic minorities as passive others against which the Anglo-American male constructs himself. By linking the salvation of the planet Earth to issues of social equality, ecofeminism contributes to our understanding of the place of human structures of domination and power in environmental change. Perhaps no environmentalist of the 20th century was better able to bridge the divide among Muir's ecological thinking, Thoreau's pastoralism, ecofeminism, and eventually environmental justice theory than Rachel Carson. Silent Spring, written in 1962, is her best-known book, and brought attention to the damage to an ecosystem consisting of rivers, streams, birds, and fish, as a consequence of widespread use of pesticides, particularly DDT. Carson understood that toxic fish and birds would eventually enter the human food chain, poisoning human animals as well as wildlife. Carson's book inspired a bipartisan environmental movement, culminating in the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency on December 2, 1970, by executive order of President Richard M. Nixon. Building on the work of Rachel Carson, theorists of environmental justice and environmental racism point out that the anti-urban bias of preservation politics has often resulted in the creation of toxic ghettos in cities, while cordoning off scenic wonderlands. As Jim Tarter notes, some live more downstream than others, and those people tend to be poorer and darker and to have little or no access to environmental policymakers. For Robert D. Bullard, the term environmental racism more accurately describes environmental policies and industry practices that provide benefits to whites while shifting costs to people of color. Environmental justice movements, including the environmentalism of the poor and climate justice activism in developing countries, place the survival of poor and marginalized people at the center of environmental activism. In recent years, there have been no greater demonstrations of the concern of scholars like Tarter and Bullard than the Flint water crisis and the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. The first was a product of state and municipal decisions to switch to untreated drinking water from the Detroit River, but with roots in the widespread dumping of industrial waste into the waterways by automobile manufacturers and other heavy industries, as well as municipalities over the course of the 20th century. The second united diverse constituencies, Sioux, delegations of other indigenous peoples, traditional conservationists, veterans, farmers, and ranchers, who shared a fear that the pipeline passing beneath the Missouri River would imperil drinking water along the entire 2,341-mile stretch of the longest river in North America and related waterways. These two events show how movements for environmental preservation have shifted from a focus on bounded wilderness landscapes to one that centers on water and the way that water navigates and links vast networks of communities. In neither case was the keyword environment as central as it might have been in earlier decades, perhaps because it has become associated with the left-leaning partisanship in the intervening years. The Flint water crisis is frequently framed as a public health issue, and the activists at Standing Rock saw themselves as water protectors. Veterans, in particular, understood the protest as part of their mission to defend the land and waterways against corporate greed. Contemporary activists and thinkers are questioning relations of power, agency, and responsibility to human and non-human systems, allowing the keyword environment to intersect with other terms, most notably climate change, global warming, and Anthropocene. Jan Yalsowicz, Mark Williams, Colin N. Waters point out that we are now living in the Anthropocene because of the scale of human-driven chemical, physical, and biological changes to the Earth's atmosphere, land, and surface oceans, while others fault capitalism and modernity for the failure to grapple with climate change, and call attention to the relationship between climate change and history of race, colonialism, and slavery. The unequal impact of rising sea levels, desertification, droughts, record heat patterns, and the melting of polar ice caps have already resulted in challenges to those identities as more people become climate change migrants, crossing social, cultural, and geopolitical borders in search of environmental and climate justice. As the focus on water and the health of the oceans has broadened the appeal of activism, it has simultaneously forced a more critical rethinking of the use of the term environment in the context of the specific and uneven threats to life posed by global climate change.